What would you do if you were at the bottom of the abyss and understood that no one would come? This is not a metaphor nor a dramatic exaggeration. It is the most honest and silent scene that someone can face. He believed, like so many others, that there would always be someone who would pull him up when he was about to fall. Someone who would hold him when his strength failed, when tears became too heavy to hide. But that day, there was no one. The doors closed one by one. Messages remained in the void of oblivion. Faces that once smiled became distant silhouettes, fading into the mist of a world that doesn't wait, that doesn't look back. And then he remained there, paralyzed, with a lump in his throat and his heart tight, wondering, what? Where is everyone? Until, between anguish and desperation, another question arose. Much more brutal, much more true. And now, what do I do? It was in that instant when he understood, no one would come. There would be no magical redemption, no unexpected savior running at the last moment. There would be no applause, no understanding. There was only him, and the abyss. And in that silence, without witnesses, without an audience, he understood something that would change everything. Either I get up, or I disappear. He took a deep breath. He looked at the ground like someone contemplating the broken pieces of his own reflection. And then, for the first time, he saw the truth hidden in all stories of overcoming. Salvation never comes from outside. The hand he had waited for so long was, from the beginning, his own. And you, what would you do? Would you keep waiting day after day for someone to come save you? Or would you accept, once and for all, that no one will come, and then you would start saving yourself? This is the story of someone who stopped waiting, and decided to become his own savior. Stoic Millionaire, what would you do if no one came to save you? What would you do if you were at the bottom of the abyss and understood that no one would come? This is not a metaphor nor a dramatic exaggeration. It is the most honest and silent scene that someone can face. He believed, like so many others, that there would always be someone who would pull him up when he was about to fall. Someone who would hold him when his strength failed, when tears became too heavy to hide. But that day, there was no one. The doors closed one by one. Messages remained in the void of oblivion. Faces that once smiled became distant silhouettes, fading into the mist of a world that doesn't wait, that doesn't look back. And then he remained there, paralyzed, with a lump in his throat and his heart tight, wondering, what? Where is everyone? Until, between anguish and desperation, another question arose. Much more brutal, much more true. And now, what do I do? It was in that instant when he understood, no one would come. There would be no magical redemption, no unexpected savior running at the last moment. There would be no applause, no understanding. There was only him, and the abyss. And in that silence, without witnesses, without an audience, he understood something that would change everything. Either I get up, or I disappear. He took a deep breath. He looked at the ground like someone contemplating the broken pieces of his own reflection. And then, for the first time, he saw the truth hidden in all stories of overcoming. Salvation never comes from outside. The hand he had waited for so long was, from the beginning, his own. And you, what would you do? Would you keep waiting day after day for someone to come save you? Or would you accept, once and for all, that no one will come, and then you would start saving yourself? This is the story of someone who stopped waiting, and decided to become his own savior. After that day, silence became his only companion. Not the comfortable silence of someone who finds peace within himself, but the cold, dense, oppressive silence, that kind of silence that weighs on the shoulders and tightens the chest. He walked through the streets without hearing his own name. He sat in cafes where no one noticed him. He woke up and fell asleep without anyone caring. And for a long time he believed that silence was his worst enemy. The absence of advice, of hugs, of support, seemed to confirm that he had failed. But little by little he understood something that changed his relationship with that void. The silence, which once crushed him, was teaching him what no one had ever told him. Without voices to distract him. Without advice to confuse him. Without empty promises to feed illusions. Only he remained. And the naked and raw truth about who he really was. And then he understood. Silence is the cruelest teacher, but also the most honest. It doesn't soothe. It doesn't comfort. It doesn't deceive. But it shows, with implacable clarity, where the cracks are, the weaknesses, the blind spots. It shows what must be strengthened. It shows who you really are, when no one is watching. And you, how do you deal with silence? Do you flee from it, seeking distractions, noises, empty presences? Or do you have the courage to face it, and let it sculpt your strength? He chose not to flee. He sat in the center of that void and let silence transform him. One of the most brutal revelations and liberating that he experienced in his journey was this: no one owes you anything. For years he had lived believing that the world should offer him something in return: recognition, help, a rescue. But when he found himself alone, facing the abyss, he understood the truth that most fear to admit. Life is not a debt that others are obligated to pay. No one has the responsibility to save us. And that idea, which at first seemed cold, almost inhuman, began to sink deeply like a seed that germinates in the crack of a stone. Because by accepting that no one owed him anything, he stopped waiting. He stopped blaming. He stopped begging for support, understanding, validation. And then something changed. The rage transformed into serenity. The frustration into autonomy. The pain into strength. What would happen if you also accepted this truth? Would you keep waiting for them to rescue you? Or would you start building your own way out? He chose the second path. Because when you understand that no one owes you anything, you finally realize that everything you need is already within you. After accepting that no one would come, after stopping waiting, he began to build something he didn't even know existed. An inner fortress. It wasn't visible. There were no walls. There were no banners. But it was there, in every silent decision, in every morning when he got up without anyone noticing, in every night when he resisted, even without having anyone to embrace. That fortress wasn't built from great gestures or spectacular triumphs. It was built on silent constancy. On the self-discipline he demanded of himself when no one else was watching. On the unbreakable commitment to his own emotional survival. And it was then when he understood something that many never understand. True strength is not the one that shouts, but the one that persists in silence. That strength, no one sees it, but everyone senses it. It's that presence that is perceived when someone enters a room and doesn't need to speak to be respected. It's that serenity in the gaze of someone who has been in hell and has returned with scars turned into wisdom. And you, are you building that fortress? Or are you still waiting for circumstances to strengthen you from the outside? He decided to do it from within, because he understood that the only walls that would protect him would be the ones he himself would raise. He had lost almost everything: the people he trusted, the securities he believed unshakable, the certainties that sustained him. But there was something he couldn't lose. Something that, in the midst of chaos, remained firm as the only structure that didn't collapse. His self-discipline. At first it seemed like a minor detail. Getting up early, eating well, exercising. Small acts that many consider banal. But in that solitude, in that void where there were no longer hugs or encouraging words, those small rituals became his safest refuge. Because while everything around him collapsed, while uncertainty devoured his nights, self-discipline reminded him that there was still something he could control: himself. Every time he chose to continue, despite fatigue, despite fear, despite the temptation to give up, he was reinforcing that invisible fortress. He was building day after day a refuge within himself, from which no one could expel him. And you? What do you take refuge in when everything crumbles? Do you seek comfort in the external, or do you discipline yourself to find peace in the internal? He chose the latter. And that was the decision that would forever change his destiny. There was a day when, upon awakening, he realized something he had until then avoided admitting. He had been waiting too long. Waiting for someone to understand him. Waiting for someone to call him. Waiting for wounds to stop hurting, for abandonment to stop weighing, for the void to fill itself, as if by magic. He waited, because that's how he had been taught. To trust that if he endured long enough, someone would come. To believe that suffering would pass by itself, that life would take care of balancing the accounts. But that day, the silence was too strong to keep ignoring it. He got up and, while looking at himself in the mirror, couldn't help but see in his own eyes the image he so feared. He wasn't the victim of a betrayal. He wasn't simply a wounded man. He was a man paralyzed by waiting. And then he understood it, with a mixture of rage, sadness, and lucidity. Waiting is killing me. Every day that passed motionless, feeding the hope that someone would come, was a day when he gave up on himself. And then the question became unavoidable. Until when? How much longer was he going to postpone his life? How much longer was he going to let pain decide for him? He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and in that instant, for the first time, he didn't wait. It wasn't a grandiose decision. There was no master plan. There was no sudden illumination. Just a silent certainty. He had to act, and so he did. Small acts, almost imperceptible, but in that context, monumental. A call he had postponed for months, made with a trembling but firm voice. An email sent although shame burned his stomach. A decision made, although fear whispered to him to stay where he was. Step by step. Without applause. Without witnesses. Without guarantees. But with a determination he had never felt before. He wasn't going to wait anymore. Because he understood that waiting kept him anchored to pain. But action, although it terrified him, was the only way to regain control. The only way to save himself. And you? How much longer are you going to wait? Will you remain motionless, waiting for life to change by itself? Or is it time to get up and start acting? When he finally began to act, when he stopped waiting and took his first steps, he discovered something he had never been warned about. Acting also has a price. It's not true, as they usually say, that it's enough to decide for everything to improve. It's not true that action by itself guarantees relief or company. Sometimes, as happened to him, action leaves you more alone than ever. Because by moving you break others' expectations. Because by deciding to stop being a victim, you challenge the comfortable narratives that many have assigned to you. Because by acting you leave behind those who prefer to remain motionless. And that was precisely what happened. The few who remained close didn't understand his decision. They didn't comprehend his need to stop waiting and start moving. Some even accused him of being cold, selfish, as if acting to save oneself were a betrayal. But he knew deep down that it wasn't. It was necessary. For the first time he stopped asking permission to be who he needed to be. For the first time he accepted that solitude wasn't a punishment, but the inevitable space he had to traverse to transform himself. Yes, it hurt. Conscious solitude always hurts more than imposed solitude. Because it's no longer the solitude that others impose on you. It's the solitude you choose because you know it's the only path to freedom. Every night when returning home he felt that void. That heavy, cutting silence. But he no longer interpreted it as a sign of defeat. Now he understood that this solitude was his construction space. There, in that place stripped of everything, he began to build the most authentic version of himself. Without ornaments. Without masks. Without need for approval. And although sometimes nostalgia hit him, although occasionally he longed for a hand, a hug, a voice that would rescue him, he knew he couldn't go back. He had crossed an invisible line. He had stopped being the one who waited, and was becoming the one who built his own path, step by step, in solitude but with dignity intact. And you? Would you be capable of paying that price? Or would you keep waiting for company, even if that means remaining motionless? He chose to move, even if it cost him the company of those who weren't ready to walk by his side. After weeks, perhaps months, of small but firm steps, of endless silences and solitary decisions, he began to notice something that at first he didn't even know how to name. He was being reborn. It wasn't an epic explosion. There was no triumphant music. There was no audience, no applause, no congratulations. His rebirth was silent, discreet, almost invisible. Every day he got up and chose to act. Every time that, despite fear, he advanced one more step. Every moment when he decided to keep building himself, he was letting an old version of himself die. That version that waited, that depended, that victimized itself, that believed its value depended on external validation. And at the same time, another version was being born. More raw, more real, stronger. A version that no longer needed to be saved, because it had learned to stand on its own feet. But this process, like every authentic rebirth, wasn't glorious, but painful. Every detachment from an old belief hurt like tearing off skin. Every goodbye to an illusion generated a cold and piercing void. Every step toward his self-salvation was also a brutal confirmation. There was no turning back. And in the midst of that process he realized something that few admit. The deepest rebirths are not those that others celebrate. They are those that no one sees, that no one applauds, that happen in the silence of daily decisions, when no one is watching. And there, in that silence, in that space where only he and his new identity under construction existed, he understood that this was the freedom he had always sought. Not the noisy freedom of one who shouts his victory, but the serene freedom of one who no longer depends on others to exist. And you? Would you be willing to be reborn knowing that no one will applaud you? Could you go through that process without witnesses, without recognition, just for you? He did it. And in that silence, he found something that no one could ever take away from him. The peace of having saved himself. At this point in his journey, when he had already stopped waiting, when he had started acting, when he had accepted solitude as price and as refuge, he discovered a strength that until then he didn't know he possessed. It wasn't physical strength, nor that of success that others can see and admire. It wasn't the strength of those who impose themselves on others, nor that of those who make themselves heard by shouting. It was something much more subtle, much deeper, and, for that very reason, much more indestructible. Silent strength. That strength that doesn't need to proclaim itself, that doesn't need applause, that doesn't seek to be recognized because it simply is. A strength that manifests itself in the ability to remain standing when everything around collapses. In the choice to keep going when emotions scream to stop. In the determination to be true to oneself, even when no one else notices or understands it. And it was then that he understood one of the most valuable lessons of his process. True strength is not shouted, it is sustained. Every day he chose to get up, every time he said no to the temptation to give up, every moment when he clung to his principles despite solitude, fatigue, emptiness, he was consolidating that silent strength, that strength that, although invisible to the world, was what allowed him to continue. And curiously, the more silent it was, the more solid it became. Harder to break. Because it didn't depend on external stimuli, nor on approvals, nor on recognition. It depended only on one thing, on his decision to sustain himself, despite everything. And you, how do you sustain your strength? Do you need them to see you strong to feel strong? Or could you be like him, and find in silence the strength that sustains everything, even when no one applauds, when no one is watching? He chose the latter. And in that choice, he became someone unbreakable. Until that moment, like almost everyone, he had considered pain as something to be avoided. He had run from it. He had tried to distract himself, anesthetize himself, deny it. He believed for years that being strong was being able not to feel, not to break, not to let sadness touch him. But in the silent process of self-salvation he was going through, in those days of solitude, of silences that chilled the bones, of decisions that tore, he discovered a truth that confronted him with the rawest part of himself. Pain is not something to flee from. It's part of the path that transforms. And by assuming it, he stopped seeing it as an enemy, as an obstacle, as punishment, and began to see it for what it really is, a teacher. Because every pang of solitude taught him about his capacity to be with himself. Every contained tear showed him how much strength he had accumulated in his silence. Every disappointment forced him to look within, and to purify what he could no longer keep carrying. Then he understood that pain, far from being a sign of weakness, was the signal that he was changing. That something within him, something deep and structural, was being reconfigured. And that if he wanted to become the person he aspired to be, he couldn't skip that process. He couldn't pretend it didn't hurt. He couldn't disguise it. He couldn't flee. He had to stay there, look pain in the eyes, and let it pass through him. Because he understood with brutal clarity that pain doesn't destroy you, it purifies you. And you, how do you face your pain? Do you keep running, seeking distractions that only postpone it? Or do you have the courage to, like him, let pain pass through you, and transform you? He chose the latter. And in that act of silent courage, he took one of the most important steps in his self-salvation process. After having faced pain, after having stopped fleeing, after having looked it straight on and let it pass through him, an unexpected moment arrived. But not a superficial peace, not that apparent calm that is feigned while inside everything continues burning, but a real peace, deep, silent, of those that cannot be bought, nor can be imposed. They can only be found when you stop fighting against the inevitable. For years he had resisted reality. He had fought against abandonment, against betrayal, against solitude, against pain. He believed that if he held on with enough strength, he could prevent life from being as it was. But in this self-salvation process, he understood that part of his suffering didn't come only from what had happened to him, but from his refusal to accept it. He fought against accomplished facts, against immutable truths, against what simply is. And that fight was wearing him down more than the pain itself. Then one day in one of those long and dense silences, he let go. He stopped resisting. He stopped fighting. He stopped battling against solitude, against absence, against reality. And by doing so, he experienced something he had never felt. Because he understood that true strength is not in resisting the inevitable, but in accepting what cannot be changed, and focusing on what does depend on oneself. As Epictetus would say, of things some depend on us and others do not. And he finally understood it. He stopped wearing himself out trying to change what was beyond his control, and put all his energy into transforming what did belong to him. His attitude, his discipline, his gaze, his path. And you, how much of your suffering comes from fighting against what you cannot change? Until when will you keep spending your strength on useless resistances, instead of focusing your energy on what really depends on you? He did it. He let go of the fight. And in that act, he found the peace he had searched for all his life. After everything lived, the pain traversed, the solitude accepted, the silence embraced, he arrived at one of the most powerful and transformative understandings of his life. Emotional independence is the only real freedom. Until then, he had believed that freedom consisted of being able to do what he wanted, in having success, in accumulating achievements, in obtaining recognition. But upon losing all that, upon finding himself alone, upon having nothing more than his own company, he discovered that true freedom has nothing to do with what you possess, nor with what others think of you, but with your capacity to not depend emotionally on anyone. It didn't mean becoming cold, nor renouncing love, nor enclosing himself in an impenetrable armor. It meant simply understanding that his well-being, his balance, his peace, could not be in others' hands. That while he continued needing someone to validate him, to approve him, to recognize him, he would always be vulnerable, always be dependent, always be at the mercy of forces he couldn't control. And it was then, in that act of stoic lucidity, that he decided to make himself absolute owner of his inner world. He promised himself never again to deliver his happiness to another human being's trembling hands. Not because he didn't want to love, not because he didn't want to share, but because he understood that the foundation of any healthy relationship, of any authentic project, is emotional independence. That capacity to be at peace, to remain firm, to choose freely, without his value depending on others' gaze. And in that moment he felt freer than ever. He didn't need to prove anything. He didn't need to convince anyone. He didn't need to be saved, because he had already saved himself. And you? What does your peace depend on? Do you still deliver your happiness to others, waiting for them to take care of you, to approve you, to complete you? Or are you ready, like him, to reclaim your emotional independence, and experience finally, the only freedom that no one can take away from you? He did it. And in that silent decision, he became a truly free man. But freedom came with a realization that shook him to his core. The world looked different now. The same streets, the same faces, the same conversations. But everything felt distant, as if he were observing life through a protective glass that kept him safe but also separated. He realized that emotional independence had transformed him into someone who no longer fit the old patterns. People around him were still waiting, still complaining, still seeking validation, still living in the hope that someone would come to solve their problems, to give them direction, to tell them what to feel. And he no longer belonged to that world. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't superiority. It was simply the natural consequence of his transformation. When you stop needing others to feel complete, you inevitably distance yourself from those who still live in that need. This created a peculiar kind of solitude. Not the desperate solitude of someone who has been abandoned, but the conscious solitude of someone who has chosen a different path. Sometimes, in social gatherings, in casual conversations, he would catch himself listening to complaints that once would have resonated with him deeply. Now they sounded like echoes from a past life. A life where he, too, had been a prisoner of circumstances, of others' opinions, of external validation. And in those moments he understood something profound. True growth creates inevitable distance. Not because you want to be different, but because you simply are different. Your priorities change. Your needs change. Your way of seeing the world is no longer the same. And that's when he realized the final price of self-salvation. You become alone, but you're no longer lonely. Because loneliness is the absence of what you need. And he no longer needed what most people desperately seek. He had found something infinitely more valuable, the company of himself. But perhaps the most surprising discovery was this: self-salvation is not a destination, it's a daily practice. He thought that once he had achieved that inner fortress, once he had found peace with solitude, once he had developed emotional independence, the process would be complete. But he was wrong. Every day brought new challenges, new temptations to return to old patterns, new situations that tested his resolve, new moments when the old version of himself would whisper, maybe it would be easier to go back. And it was then that he understood the most crucial lesson of all. Salvation is not something you achieve once and keep forever. It's something you choose, every single day. Every morning when he woke up, he had to choose again. Would he be the man who waited or the man who acted? Would he be the one who sought validation or the one who found value within himself? Some days were easier than others. Some mornings he felt invincible, unshakable in his resolve. Other days, the weight of solitude felt heavy, and the temptation to reach out, to seek comfort in others, was almost overwhelming. But in those difficult moments, he remembered something that had become his personal mantra. The strength you've built in silence is more reliable than any comfort someone else can offer you. Because he had learned that external comfort is temporary, conditional, and unpredictable. But the strength he had cultivated within himself, that was permanent, unconditional, and entirely under his control. And slowly, day by day, choice by choice, that daily practice of self-salvation became as natural as breathing. He no longer had to think about it. He no longer had to force it. It had become part of who he was. The man who had learned to save himself, every single day. And in that consistency, in that daily commitment to his own growth, he found something unexpected: purpose. Not the grand, external purpose that society tells us to seek. Not the purpose that comes from achievements, recognition, or leaving a mark on the world. But the quiet, internal purpose that comes from being the guardian of your own soul. Every day that he chose strength over weakness, action over waiting, self-reliance over dependence, he was fulfilling the most important mission of his life, the mission of becoming the man he was meant to be. And that mission, he realized, would never end. There would always be room to grow, to strengthen, to refine the art of self-salvation. But for the first time in his life, that didn't feel like a burden. It felt like freedom. The freedom to know that no matter what life threw at him, no matter who left, no matter what failed, he would always have himself. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. And so, without anyone noticing, without there being a celebration, without there being applause or witnesses, he had become another man. Not someone perfect, not someone who no longer felt pain, not someone immune to solitude or fear, but someone who simply no longer waited. He had stopped waiting for others to save him. He had stopped waiting for life to be fair. He had stopped waiting for love or recognition to complete him. And by doing so, he had saved himself. Not because life had become easier, not because the world was less hostile, not because the scars had disappeared, but because finally he had taken charge of himself. He had understood that his salvation wasn't anyone else's responsibility, that his strength didn't depend on how many loved him, nor on how many accompanied him, nor on how many validated him, but on his capacity to sustain himself, to rebuild himself, to get up, despite everything. And now he walked through the world with silent serenity, with a dignity that didn't need to be exhibited, with a strength that didn't seek to be admired, because he knew something that very few know: that true self-salvation is silent, is invisible, and is, above all, inevitable for those who wish to live with integrity. And you? Will you keep waiting for someone to come save you? Or, like him, will you accept that no one will come, and finally take charge of your own salvation? You did it. And that's why he never again was the same. If you felt that this content touched something within you, like the video, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who also needs to hear this. Leave in the comments, what part marked you the most? That helps the channel continue existing, and you help other people to be reborn in silence.